You open up your bag of specialty coffee. You weigh, grind, and the aroma blows your mind. Your brew goes perfectly, but what went wrong? Your water, that's what. Third Wave Water helps give that cafe quality experience at home, unlocking all the bright flavors your coffee has to offer. Just add 1 stick of minerals to a gallon of distilled water to upgrade your coffee experience. Visit thirdwavewater.com and use coupon code COFFEEPODCAST for 10% off your first order. Before a coffee tree's burgundy red cherries ripen, there is a long journey of deep, unseen growth within the plant that only becomes visible with a fleeting bloom of white, fragrant as the heart flowers. Human ripening requires the same extensive and beautiful process of quiet becoming, often in the face of the unknown. What you just heard is an excerpt from Chapter 3 of the We Belong anthology of Colombian women coffee farmers by Lucia Bawot, our guest today. When was the last time that you sat down and thought about where you come from, your heritage? What were your grandparents like? What did they accomplish? And how did that impact your life? And how does that maybe play a role in who you are today? Lucia starts us off in this first part of our interview with her as we explore her past, beyond her past. In fact, we go back into the stories of her grandparents and what it meant to be coffee producers. Stay tuned to the end of the episode to learn how you can win a copy of We Belong from the Coffee Podcast partnered with Lucia Bawot. Well, welcome to the show. I want to dive a little bit into your background. I read that there's some coffee in your background, but tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to where you are today, and how does your life relate to coffee?
Yeah, that's a long story, and one I never thought I would be sharing. I never thought I was going to be working in coffee. So I do have a coffee background on my mother's side of the family. I'm born and raised in Colombia in a region that is called Quindío. It's the smallest state in Colombia. My grandparents on my mother's side, they were both coffee farmers and they grew up in coffee farms. And then they both moved to Quindío. They're from other regions, so Antioquia and Caldas. My grandfather became basically a buyer and seller of green coffee or parchment coffee. And then he had his own place where he was selling and buying. And then he also bought a few coffee farms. But the most interesting part about his story is that he founded a coffee town in Colombia that is called Buena Vista. So this is all I knew about him. I never got to meet him because he passed away a year before I was born. So it was always a fun story for me to listen to my grandmother share with me, and my mom and all my family. It was interesting, but it never was something that it dawned on me, or I was oh my God, this is so interesting. And then with my grandmother, which is something really interesting, is that she was also a coffee farmer. She used to tell me a lot of stories when she was little, picking up coffee, when she had to cook for the workers in the farm, and that she had to cook for 45 workers when she was 10 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, and she always repeat the same stories to the point that we were okay, can you tell us something new? And it was always about my grandfather. He was the hero of the family. Because he was a pretty inspirational person. He was pretty open-minded, and for him it was really important that all his daughters got educated. So I was so weird. He was born in 1896. So that's why I think is this whole idea that my grandfather was the hero has been a thing in my family.
Yeah.
And I'm telling all of this just to summarize it to that when I started writing We Belong and creating the content for the book, I realized that I basically have never honored my grandmother. I never thought of her as a coffee farmer. I always saw her just as a loving grandmother. And this book really opened my eyes to see, oh my God, she's in fact a coffee farmer, and she embodies a lot of the things that I found in the stories of the women that I interview and photograph. So yeah, that's my coffee background. And then how did I get into coffee? So that was my background, and I knew that was part of my history, and I had ancestors related to coffee. But in my family, my parents had nothing to do with coffee. My mom had a transportation company in Colombia. So for us, it was all about transportation, just cars and buses, and it was so different different. In my house, we didn't even like care so much about coffee or drinking coffee, really. Many years went by, and I ended up going to Buenos Aires, Argentina to study. And when I was there, mate was my staple beverage, like what I was drinking all the time. It was all about mate.
Yeah, it's pretty hip.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what people drink there. And for me, it was not a coffee at all.
Yeah.
But a year before I was about to finish my degree, Olga Cuellar, I don't know, maybe you've heard of her. She is the daughter of one of my mom's best friends, and she works in coffee. And she's like, she used to work for Sustainable Harvest. And now she has her own company in Colombia that is called Promising Crops. So she reached out to me on Facebook, and she told me, I really like your work. At that time, I really wanted to become a fashion photographer. So different. So she just reached out to me and she was like, I love your work. I would love to see if there's like maybe an opportunity for you to come as a volunteer, as a photographer, like a volunteer photographer for Let's Talk Coffee.
Cool.
And at this point, I didn't know anything about Sustainable Harvest, Let's Talk Coffee. I didn't know much about coffee. And I was like, okay, yes, let's do it. Like, that sounds fun. I was like 20 years old. I was like, yeah, that sounds really fun. So we tried 2 years, but David, he thought I was really young. And he was like, no, I think she's really young. We have to wait a little bit more time. So finally, the last year of university, she reached out to me again and she was like, let's try again. So I sent my CV, my work, everything, and I got when the Let's Talk Coffee was in El Salvador.
Okay.
So I ended up going to El Salvador.
Nice.
Basically, that's when I saw how crazy big this industry was. Like, it was the best way of seeing coffee so quick, because like when you go to Let's Talk Coffee, you basically see people from the entire supply chain. You see producers, but then you see roasters, and you see like everyone in the supply chain. That's really when I saw like, wow, this is so interesting. And people were so open, they were so welcoming.
Yeah.
I was asking a lot of questions because I didn't know anything.
Yeah. I'm sure you were learning a ton. I'm curious for you in that moment, just thinking back to your grandparents, was it kind of this major connection point for you? Did you connect the dots? Was it revolutionary, or did you just kind of like step in and go, oh, wow, this is big?
Yeah, no, I don't think I connected the dots there. It was more like, wow, there are other industries where I can pursue photography.
Yeah.
There are other industries where there are a lot of people involved and people that are passionate. So I think for me it was that. And then I was going as a volunteer, but I was also assisting the main photographer, which is a New Yorker. His name is Clay Ennis, and he's like pretty well known because he's like the photographer for this action movie, like Sucker Punch, Superman. Like, he's the one like creating the posters, like the photos. So at some point I sat down with him and I asked him, I was like, hey, like, you have way more experience than me. I just want to ask you for an advice. Like, I'm almost done with my degree and I really don't know where to go from here, right? I feel like everyone, when they're finishing their degree, they really don't know what they want to do. It's like everyone is so lost. It's like, so what do I do next? I spent 5 years learning so much, but I don't know where to go.
Yeah, it's a big transition, isn't it?
Yeah. So I asked him, I was like, what do you think I should do? I'm interested in fashion photography, but I would like to move to New York. And I think this is the dream for a lot of photographers that want to pursue fashion. And he laughed and he looked at me, and then he was like, he pointed at the people. Like, we were in a conference room and there were a ton of people just sitting. And he pointed at like the people, and then he said like, here, this is your future. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, coffee industry needs creators. It needs artists. It needs people that can be the bridge to connect this beverage that people enjoy so much, but they still know so little about. They need people that are willing to tell stories. He was like, if I was you, I would pursue coffee photography. Yeah. And that was the greatest advice. So I went back to Argentina and I was like, well, I guess this is what I want to do. But I didn't have any photos of any, like, at this point, I hadn't even been in a coffee farm in Colombia. My first time going to a coffee farm was during that event. Oh, wow. Which is, it's pretty crazy. So I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? In Argentina, they don't grow coffee. So when I went to Colombia for vacations, I made this whole strategy that I was going to visit farms, and I reached out to a few of my mom's friends that I knew they had coffee farms. And I just went there and took photos. And really, that's when you were asking me if I was connecting the dots, or like this family history. I think that's when that happened. When I went to these farms and I started photographing pickers and just like seeing a farm, right? Like, and seeing it through my lens, that's when it dawned on me. I was like, wow, this is what my grandparents used to do.
Cool.
And then after that, I worked for Sustainable Harvest for a year. But not as a photographer. I work in like more like the logistics of the Lesto coffee.
Oh, okay.
And after that, I decided to pursue my own like freelance career. And it's been 10 years since I work in coffee, and I had the opportunity to work for more than 12 leading companies in the coffee industry,
Cool.
traveled throughout like Central and South America, visited more than 600 farmers. It's been delightful. It's been a journey. And really, as I mentioned at the beginning, I never thought I would be telling this story that I am a documentary photographer. Never thought that was going to be my future when I was 20, living in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
What a story from where you were to where you ended up, and then connecting the dots, ending up in coffee. I mean, we're going to get into more of We Belong here in a second.
Sure.
I want to ask you just two more sort of background questions. The first one is the Entre Campos travel, is that related to your parents' business, or how does that relate to the story?
That's a great question, and this is a question I've never got asked before. So Entre Campos Travel was a tourist company I had. So after I stopped working for Sustainable Harvest, I moved back to my hometown, trying to figure out what to do. And then I decided to create a tourist company that facilitated trips for foreigners, most of them Americans, to go to Colombia, but to fully experience and immerse in the Colombian culture. So we offer like different activities like dancing lessons and painting lessons, and they were all connected with like artisans and locals, right?
Very neat.
And then I brought photography into the project because what we did is that we hire a photographer that will document the whole trip. So people didn't need to have their phone or bring their cameras or worry about taking photos.
Yeah, what a great idea.
Yeah, so I had that company, like I think for 2 years, then I sold the company because I wanted to pursue coffee.
Very cool.
So I didn't have enough time, and then I was like, okay, I guess like coffee is just like pulling me more and more, and I need to make a choice.
Yeah.
And I chose coffee.
Very cool. And my last sort of silly question here is, what is binaural beats? I was just like, what is this?
Yeah, so when you are a photographer, you spend a lot of time in front of the computer. A lot of time just editing and editing and editing and editing. So one day I stumbled upon this article where they were talking about binaural beats and why it's like really a good way to get your mind to reach a certain mental state. So what it is like binaural beats is an illusion created by the brain when you listen to two tones, slightly different frequencies at the same time. So it's not like music that is like is not necessarily pleasant because it's just two sounds combining.
Yeah.
And what happens is that your brain interprets those two tones as a beat on his own.
Oh.
And then these two tones align with your brain waves and produce a beat with a different frequency.
I got to try this out. I wonder if I can like inject it into the episode somehow.
Yeah, and what it does is like your brain activity matches the frequency set by the frequency of the beat. And this get you to reach a certain mental state. So it can be like just concentration. It can help you with stress. It can help you like if you want to meditate, you can listen to it. But you really need to wear headphones because you're getting two different tones. So you cannot listen it without headphones.
Okay.
And there are many. So there is like beta, alpha, theta, like all these different sounds. And yeah, it's like a good way to help your brain reach a certain mental state.
I'm going to be so embarrassed if everybody knows about this and I'm just like living under a rock.
No. And I think maybe people do listen to it, but I don't think people understand well what it is.
Okay.
But yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's even being used for therapy, like for mental health.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're gonna step away from that. I want to talk about We Belong. So why did you choose the title?
Ooh. Well, after finishing We Belong, I now realize why I named it We Belong. But to be completely honest with you, that name came out of nowhere. I remember I was sitting in my parents' house in Armenia when this idea just became an idea. It was like a vision. It was like so unreal. I was like, this is not going to happen. This is going to take me years to make a book this seems so daunting and so big. So I remember sitting, I was like, well, I guess I need to name this project to start working on them. And then I was like, well, I've been feeling, since I started working in coffee, I felt like an outsider, right? Because yes, I love coffee. The more I work in coffee, the more I wanted to learn. So I took like barista courses, cupping courses, sustainability courses. But still, I felt like being a photographer and a filmmaker, it was not gonna grant me the key to belonging to the coffee industry because I was just the photographer. I was not a coffee person. And that's all the comments I got and the sense I got from everyone in the industry. I was like, well, I guess I don't belong to coffee. And then I started looking at my portfolio, trying to figure out, okay, what do I want to do? I knew I wanted to make a book, but I didn't know exactly about what. And then flipping through my portfolio, I realized I didn't have any photos where the women were the protagonists of the stories. They were in the photos. They were in the family portraits. They were in photos with their partners, but never like, they were not the ones like telling the story. So I was like, oh, they feel just like me, unrepresented, invisible. So that's when I was like, we also belong to the industry. And that's when I thought about this idea of we belong. But now, after finishing the book, it's like even more powerful because there's this quote by Liz Foyslin, and she says that diversity is having a seat at a table, that inclusion is having a voice, but belonging is having that voice be heard. So I feel that's we belong. We belong is the space where finally these women, these coffee farmers and coffee pickers get to speak up, tell their stories, have a voice, and more importantly, these voices are finally being heard. So that's why the book is named We Belong.
Nice. And you spent 20 months, I'm stealing these stats from your website, 20 months, 130 cups of coffee with women in different coffee producing regions. You hit 7 coffee regions total, and you set out to do it. Was the original goal because you felt that this desire to communicate the value of this idea, we belong, for women in the coffee sector, or did something else stir you too?
Well, I think there are many things, but there are two that for me, I think really is what the motivation. That's where the motivation was coming from. The first one was a little bit egotistical. I felt like all the work and my portfolio, it was not my own. It was my clients' work. It was their vision. It was me capturing what they wanted me to capture. So I felt like this frustration throughout these years working in coffee, where I was like, this work, it doesn't represent who I am. I have things to say. I have opinions that I've been creating and building and constructing for all this time. I want a space where I can share how I feel about the industry and in a more artistic way. So that was one of the biggest goals behind making a book. And the second one, as I mentioned before, I knew there were a lot of women behind our cup of coffee every morning, right? There were a lot of women because I've seen them. And because when you go and read all these studies, it's pretty clear that in all the coffee producing regions, women are the ones doing most of the labor at the farms, all the coffee activities, on top of taking care of the children, on top of taking care of the household, cleaning the house, cooking for the workers. So for me, it felt like a responsibility as a Latina, as a woman, and as a person working in coffee for so long, it was my responsibility to create something where people could learn more about what was happening and people could finally see the invisibility of these women that are so important, so crucial for this industry we love so much. So I think those were the two main reasons why I decided to create this book.
Yeah, very cool. It's almost poetic. Your family's history in coffee, your grandfather, your grandmother, and then to sort of carry on a legacy of coffee that does something like this, highlights the women in coffee. There's just something really poetic there. I can't quite put my finger on it, but yeah, it's lovely.
No, I agree with you because at the beginning I mentioned how now I recognize and I feel kind of guilty knowing that for the longest time I didn't pay attention to the stories my grandmother was telling me and I didn't honor her for all this hard work she did. So really, when I was like halfway to creating the content for the book, I remember just sitting in a cafe, just like digesting all these interviews that were so heavy and thinking, I've heard this story before. It was repetitive. Each interview, every time I was like taking notes or writing, I was like, I've heard this before. I heard this before. And it dawned on me that it was my grandmother. So I do agree with you. It's kind of poetic. Like she kept telling me these stories. It was like, as I mentioned before, it was like kind of annoying. It was like, can you tell me something different? But she kept telling me about what she did in the farm, that she has to carry all these heavy like baskets full of like coffee cherries, all these things. And for me, it was just like, oh, okay, whatever. But now I'm like, that this makes all the sense in the world. Like she just knew that at some point it was going to be my responsibility to become an artist and then to have this platform to give these women, uplift their voices. So yeah, I agree with you. It's so poetic.
Yeah. And two, at least this is true for me, I tend to talk about things like if I'm telling stories a lot, it's stories I really cherish or stories that I take a lot of pride in. And so it sounds like your grandmother must have had a lot of pride in her work. Anyway, you took over 100,000 photos, which I'm thinking for myself wouldn't be hard to do. For me, I'd just have to hold the button down, and I'm not a photographer. I wouldn't know what I was doing, but I'm sure these were very intentional shots, trying to capture the right thing. 100,000 photos. That's a lot. I have two questions for you. One of them would be, were you nervous about losing? I mean, you're out in the coffee farms, you're around, it's kind of damp, it's kind of humid sometimes, I would have been nervous about that. And then I also want to hear about your process. How did you get down to the 270 or so in the final book?
I remember telling my husband every time I came from a trip, just like, oh my God, what am I going to do with all these photos? What if I lose a hard drive? What if just the hard drive just like stops working? What am I going to do? So I had this constant anxiety of like just copying and pasting and like having folders in different like devices and in different hard drives because yes, I was like, what if I lose all this work? What am I going to do? Yeah. So that was definitely something in the back of my mind. Always. So then I put it in like a iCloud and Dropbox and still I woke up and I was like, is everything there? Did I lose anything? So yeah, for sure. That was like, it was really funny. Yeah. I never thought I was going to take as many photos, but I think it was also this pressure of doing something for the first time. This is my first book. And more importantly, this is my first time really seeing my work like with a narrative, right? Because I always take photos and then clients use it as they please. But I never took the time to see my work and try to create a narrative. And that was tough. It was really tough. So I think it was also this pressure of like not knowing if I was taking enough photos or if the photos were worth publishing. So I think I overtook photos because of that anxiety of not knowing what I was doing.
Yeah, I've been there.
But I think like you have to take action and then try things and learn in the process. And I think that's the beauty of creating something for the first time. You don't know anything. But once you're done, you realize how much you learn and how clear things become to you. It's like, oh, now I know how to make a book and I can make it better. So for me, that's the greatest gift I got from publishing this book. And then in your question regarding how did I choose the photos, I think before I talk how do I choose the photos is how did I choose the stories? Because I visited 62 coffee farmers and coffee pickers, but only 25 made it to the book. And this was something that I was pretty like honest and clear in every visit. I told them, I'm making a book. I still don't know how I'm going to structure it, but I'm sure that not all the stories are going to make it into the book. So they all knew this. I do have like a full spread where I have a lot of Polaroids of the women that didn't made it into the book. They were not showcased and they don't have their story, but at least to have like that photo there to say you were part of this, right? Yeah. So that was the first thing. So choosing the 25 stories was really tough. And how I chose those stories is I went through a process of just having everything on my wall. And it's important to clarify that I was in Colombia. I was traveling constantly and I was moving with my husband every 1 to 2 months to a different city. So we were on the move while I was making this book, what I was trying to not only create the content, but structure the book. So I was traveling with all this like post-it notes and little photos, and every apartment we live in, I put everything on the wall and I started just seeing, okay, these two have similar stories. This one is so different. This one is really important to tell. So that was the first approach. And then little by little, I started seeing like common topics or common issues. So there were a lot of like human, like my project is a lot about human exploration rather than just like coffee farmers and their stories and growing coffee. No, it's about who these women really are and what they've been through and how did they made it to this point in their lives. So I started realizing like there were a lot of stories about childhood. There were a lot of stories about like human flourishing and resilience. There were a lot of stories about like domestic abuse, sadly. So I started just grouping those women and grouping them. And then I was like, okay, one of these women is the one that represents this topic the best. And that's how I chose the 25. And then it came the moment when I had to choose the photos for the book. And this is where I really leverage and work side by side with my teams. And this is something I haven't gotten the chance to talk about more or enough. This book became the wonderful book it is thanks to my team. So my editor is Jen Rugulo. She's the editor of 25 magazine from the Specialty Coffee Association. And I feel so honored that I got to work with her because I admire her so much. She has a lot of experience. She has the kindness. So she was like really, really helpful because I was writing this book in English, and English is not my first language. And it was my first time writing a book. It was my first time like sitting down and writing. I felt like a lot of pressure. And then my editorial designer and curator is Scott Bentley. He's the owner of Caffeine magazine. So with the help of these two wonderful people, they help me like filter all the content. And it's pretty funny because when I think about what was the toughest part of designing the book, it was definitely choosing the photos. And it was like a back and forth like conversation, almost a fight. Like fighting for a photo. It's like, no, I want that photo to be there. And he would tell me, no, Lucia, that photo is not bringing any value to the narrative. Or this photo is not going to work. Or we don't need only the good photos. We also need photos that are not so interesting to the eye, but it's a good way to help the reader just breathe.
Interesting.
Yeah. When you think about, you want the best work in your first book, you want the best photos there. And it's kind of this like, I want to feel proud and I want to show people that I'm a good photographer.
Yeah.
But you have to think about the process of reading a book.
Interesting.
And reading it with your eyes and how your brain processes images. So you cannot have only great photos. You need some photos that maybe don't have a lot of information, that are darker, that have a lot of like space so your brain can rest and then you can keep moving. So definitely like he helped me a lot with that. A lot of fights.
I'm really curious to see the photos side by side, like the photos that you're like, no, this one. That would be such a cool little like side or backstory, right?
Yeah.
That'd be pretty neat.
And I was at some point I realized like, don't stress too much about putting all the photos that you want there. Of course, like making a book is like you have like, it's your baby and you want to have full control of this baby and how it's going to look. But you also have to realize that it's important to have a team that is diverse because they have is another set of eyes that will give you great insight because I didn't know who was going to buy the book. I didn't know who was going to read the book. So it's important to have all these different perspectives.
Yeah.
And also knowing that there are always going to be new platforms and spaces where I can showcase content that didn't make it into the book.
Yeah.
So you have to just relax and trust your team, trust your gut as well. If you have to fight for a photo because you know you want that photo there and it's important to you, fight for it as well.
Yeah.
It's like a balance.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool. It's cool to hear the process. I've never heard too much behind the scenes. I mean, the really interesting thing to me about this project is the interviews, the storytelling, and the photography just all coming together. What a neat project.
Thank you.
I find that in my own youth, I forget to reflect and appreciate with any kind of gravity the people who came before me. There have been so many who have had an influence on my life, many whom I've never even gotten to speak to. I love how Lucia's story weaves in and almost takes her back to a place where she can appreciate the stories of her grandparents and beyond appreciate those stories have an impact in the lives of producers today. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that we will be giving away a copy of We Belong to one lucky coffee podcast listener, and this is how we will be doing the giveaway. If you want to participate, you need to go to thecoffeepodcast.com and subscribe to the Brews Letter. That's a newsletter with a B, like brews, because we're, funny over here. And once you subscribe, wait for the email about the giveaway. We will only be hosting giveaways to Brews Letter subscribers because those are what we consider our listeners who are the most engaged. It's also the place where you can engage us the most. The way to participate is to subscribe to the Brews Letter and wait for the follow-up sweepstakes kind of announcement email. Now, there is one caveat. We will only be doing this giveaway for U.S. listeners this time around due to a limitation in shipping. But don't let that stop you, because we want to provide you with valuable stuff in that Brews Letter, no matter where you are. Well, that about does it for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.